Happy day, YouTube. My name is John, and this is my channel, The Intermancer. On the last episode, I made a lot of progress towards defining the experiment cycle and the experiment coordinator, although I called it just experiment, I think. Let me see. What do I have here? Evaluator, experiment cycle. Okay, all I did was define experiment. Experiment cycle. So I didn't define experiment. I'm going to now, I was going to call it coordinator, but since I moved experiment to experiment cycle, now I'm going to call the experiment coordinator the experiment. And that will encapsulate the seeding and then the experiment running a certain number of experiment cycles. So let's get to that. First, I am going to make sure that my context is the way I want it to look. Experiment coordinator. Okay. Properties. Scored organism repository. Basic seeder. Okay, so let's go ahead and first off change all this experiment coordinator stuff to experiment. Edit. Okay. That's done. And now over here in the AI chat, I'll go ahead and start a new chat. You'll see here that it says I've used 85% of my plan's quota. I'm close to the end of my quota. So I'm going to pause the video here and run over to IntelliJ and just spend another $10. This is one of the downsides of AI coding, is having to constantly pay for tokens. So I'm going to give the devil his due some real quick. So I've bought some more AI tokens, but JetBrains makes it really hard for you to tell how much you have available, how much you have left. So it's not saying I have 85% of my quota here in the chat box anymore. So obviously it communicated over to the IDE, but still it's a little opaque. So create the experiment interface. MD. Okay. What's it saying here? Looks like it went ahead and did the implementation also. Okay, so it highlighted that I've described experiment as a concrete class rather than an interface, and it created that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update this. Okay. And I'll make all of this experiment impl. Change this. Default. What am I saying here? Basic. Basic experiment impl. Basic. Storing organisms. Evaluator. Okay. I have updated experimentation to clarify that experiment is an interface and is implemented by basic experiment impl. Generate the experiment interface accordingly. Now, one thing I think I'm doing different than most people who use AI is I've externalized this context, and I'm taking the time to keep the context updated with what I want it to do, all the things. So instead of just keeping it in the chat and using the chat as my full context and having just a master context there, I've externalized that all into files so that I can have small chats and refer to the files. And anytime I see something in the chat that I need to clarify or update, I'm updating it in the context file and then pointing the chat to that. Sorry, I took a moment to tend to my hair. It was going everywhere. Okay, now, experiment interface, good. Okay. All right. Once I get this experiment done, I'll be ready to move on to the API for starting an experiment and getting status back, and then I'll be ready to start the UI. Hopefully get to that today. Hopefully, we'll see. So experiment, new, experiment. Accept all. Now create basic mint impl and a test class. Okay. It's writing the implementation. Okay. That's pretty straightforward. And that's pretty straightforward. Basic experiment impl. And this is pretty easy. It's not even really doing anything with the evaluator or repositories. It's just using configuration, seeder, and experiment cycle. Everything's auto-wired together. So I might not need all those things. Configuration. So let's go ahead and get rid of those dependencies. Unused imports, update experiment in D, so it doesn't need all of those. And now the test, new basic experiment test, impl test. Apply that. Why does it need all those things? Because it didn't go back and update what it had read in. And it mocked everything out. Unused imports. And do the build. All right, and now commit. And experiment interface basic experiment impl and basic experiment impl test. Any warnings? Let's review the warnings. Let's look at that. Let's suggest refactorings. What did it do? Extend width. Ah, okay. No. How do I not accept it? Okay. I will just copy this one line. And remove the setup method. Okay. Code analysis. What? Now I've got, oh, okay. For each. Push. Okay, this was a short one. I've been needing a short one. We have the experiment, we have the experiment test. It really doesn't do much, so I didn't really spend much time with looking at the details because all it does is call the seeder and then run through the experiment cycle a certain number of times. We've tested the seeder separately, we've tested the experiment cycle separately, so we're pretty good now. For the next bit, I will add some status updates to the basic experiment class so that when I get to the UI, I can update how many cycles have been run and how many replacements and things like that. That's it. Thank you for your time.